Okay, having said all that, the important thing that I need to go through first is a discussion of some of the basic concepts that are set forth in the summary of the conventions. So what we've got are probably excerpts from about 40 specific protocols of the conventions. It's designed as 4 specific conventions. Each of those has articles within it that set, and each article discusses a specific aspect of the law of armed conflict as it applies to a certain element. After we go through the 4 conventions, there are 2 additional protocols. Of primary importance to us in all of this is Protocol 2, Additional Protocol 2, because Additional Protocol 2 tells us that militia units not authorized by a national government, not authorized by a state government, but authorized under the Constitution, the type of militia that's recognized in the Second Amendment. That is to say, every able-bodied person, originally by law, was every able-bodied person between 18 and 35. But it was recognized that at times, when you were on the frontier, if your town was attacked by Indians, every able-bodied person between 18 and 35 became every able-bodied person old enough and big enough to fire a gun, or even old enough and big enough to reload a gun, up to whatever age you were so old that you could no longer either reload a gun or even fire the gun. Because when you were surrounded by hostiles and you were outnumbered, everybody pitched in. So everybody became part of the militia. And that's fine. But the core of the militia, those who had to serve, who had no option but to serve, was everybody, every able-bodied citizen, or it was originally every able-bodied man, 18 to 35. Of course, in today's environment, we would regard that as every able-bodied person. Okay, let's talk about a couple of the specific provisions here. Article 9 in the first convention says that the International Red Cross Committee has the right to send delegates to any area within a combat zone to inspect the conditions under which any prisoners of war are being held, and to carry to any prisoners of war medicines and additional foods in addition to what the holding forces are able to provide, and you know, such emergency and toiletry articles. They can carry shampoos and soaps, things of that nature. So they can provide them with anything they can use that's not a weapon, basically, as an accommodation. It also authorizes the Red Cross to accept mail that they can send home to the person's family, friends, and loved ones. The only limitation on sending that mail is that the holding party, what's called the detaining party, the people that are holding the prisoner of war, can say, screen to make sure that they're not saying, hey, there's an aircraft plant about 400 feet south of this camp. You know, they can't give military secrets. But other than that, they're free to send mail, and it can be sent through the Red Cross. Okay. The 12th article, the 13th article provide protections for people who are wounded or sick, that they can receive treatment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What's important here is if you, as a combat person in the field, come across a doctor or a nurse or an orderly or a medic of the opposing force, as a routine condition, you can't hold them. You're required to immediately release them and allow them to return, allow them safe passage back to their unit. The exception to that is if you're holding sick or wounded prisoners, you can hold enough of the opposing forces medics, doctors, and nurses to provide essential care to the medics, or to the sick and injured prisoners. So, but they're not held as prisoners of war. You put them up as civilian guests. Okay. Personally, if I'm in the field, I don't want to hold any enemy personnel under those conditions, because they might walk home, and if they walk home, they can convey, hey, this unit's in that area, and I saw this entrance to, you know, to their. So I would simply let them go home right then. But you do have that option. Moving on, let's talk about the second convention. And again, it details specific requirements. The summary of it is this. If you're holding enemy personnel, prisoners of war, you have to treat them well. You don't have to treat them better than your own citizens, but you can't hold them like a criminal. You've got to hold them just as prisoners of war. You can't make them do labor, but if you require them to do labor, you can't make them do labor, but if you require them to do labor, a little difference in the wording there, you have to pay them for it. Salary to be the same as would be paid to one of their own citizens for doing that work. It can't be demeaning work, it can't be extremely hard work, and it cannot be dangerous work, no matter how well you pay them. You can't require anything of those natures. But you can require them to do, you know, if you need farms farmed, or the kind of routine civilian work, the day labor kind of stuff, you can, but you have to pay them. And it has to be comparable to what your own people earn for a similar level. And what you can do with that is they have to be able to spend that money that they're earning, so you make additional food things or additional clothing, or maybe there's videotapes. They get to buy access to a movie theater, to things of that nature. You know, a movie theater being a VCR setup with a television where people can watch movies or things. And you can charge them for that. There's no guarantee that they get to watch movies as a provision of being a prisoner of war. You have to give them some outlets. You have to allow them to access to the outdoor. You can't hold them indoors without light, you know, in dark conditions. You can't abuse them. You can't torture them. It's kind of common sense for us. We're real familiar with that in terms of TV shows and movies that we've all seen as to what you're prohibited from doing. But I come back again. What's the penalty for doing what you're not supposed to do? What happens if you torture a prisoner? What happens if you mistreat somebody because they're a Muslim? What happens if you mistreat a prisoner because they're a woman? What happens if you mistreat the civilian population where you're at? You know, we've all seen movies where the Germans in World War II would take, you know, one German soldier would be killed by a guerrilla, they'd grab 10 civilians and shoot them. Well, what happens at that point is that the UN is required to step in with UN forces and quell the insurrection. That means they're required to come in and shoot all the militia members. We don't want to fight that many armies. Okay. Then we get to the fact that when you're in the field, there's a limit on what kind of weapons you can use. You don't use mines. They're prohibited now by international law. You don't use chemical weapons. You don't use gases. You don't use any of those kinds of things. Okay. Do you want to ask any questions before you leave? We'll turn this off.
This has everything I need.
Okay, good. I'm I'm sorry, we had somebody here who has to leave at this point due to a prior engagement, but I wanted to make sure that any questions were answered there.